December 27th, 1943. Hill 730, San Pietro Infine, Italy. A German Obergrenadier of the 15th Panzergrenadier Division writes a final entry in a diary that American troops will recover from his body 3 days later. The Americans fight differently than the British or the Russians, he records. They bring the firepower of a machine gun nest into every house, every corner. Their automatic weapons never stop firing. He has survived 3 separate encounters with American assault troops, carrying a weapon German tactical doctrine had no real answer for. The Thompson submachine gun, a magazine-fed, blunt-nosed weapon firing the .45 ACP round at roughly 700 rounds per minute, had turned the close-quarters fighting in this Italian mountain village into something his training had not prepared him for. German infantry doctrine emphasized marksmanship, fire discipline, and careful ammunition conservation. What he was watching instead looked, to him, like men firing continuously and advancing behind the noise rather than behind aimed shots. San Pietro Infine itself was a town of stone houses terraced into a steep hillside, every approach covered by German positions sighted months in advance and reinforced with the kind of patience a static defensive line allows. The terrain, by every conventional reading available to the defenders, favored them completely. Narrow streets that channeled any attacker into predictable lanes, stone walls thick enough to stop rifle fire, elevation that gave defenders observation over every approach long before an attacker came within effective rifle range. The 1st Battalion, 143rd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, took San Pietro after 6 days of house-to-house fighting. Of the 280 German defenders from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division holding the village, only 46 survived to be taken prisoner. This is the story of how a weapon the German military establishment had formally dismissed as commercially impractical 20 years earlier became, by 1944, one of the specific things German infantry veterans pointed to when asked what had actually defeated them. German military observers had encountered reports of the Thompson in the 1920s and filed an assessment that, on its own narrow terms, was not unreasonable. At roughly $200 per unit in 1921, equivalent to well over $3,000 in modern currency, more than a year's wages for an average factory worker, the Thompson cost far more than Germany's own MP-18 submachine gun to produce. German reports back to Berlin characterized it as a weapon suited to gangsters and police work, too expensive, too ammunition-hungry, and too mechanically complex for any army to field at scale. The Wehrmacht's own infantry school maintained as late as 1940 that the submachine gun belonged to specialists, assault engineers, paratroopers, while the standard rifleman required a rifle, for the accuracy and fire discipline a rifle enforced by its slower rate of fire alone. This assessment was not stupid. It was a reasonable extrapolation from Germany's own resource constraints. The German General Staff in the 1920s had genuine grounds for the comparison. The Treaty of Versailles had capped the Reichswehr at 100,000 men and prohibited the kind of standing industrial mobilization capacity that might have let German planners imagine an opponent operating under entirely different constraints. Given Germany's actual options, the conclusion was sound. It also turned out to be wrong about the rest of the world in a way that compounded steadily across 2 decades, because the constraint it extrapolated from was specifically German rather than universal. By 1942, American manufacturers, Auto Ordnance, Savage Arms, and others, had converted John T. Thompson's original, intricate 1921 design into a mass production object through a series of deliberate cost and complexity reductions. The original Thompson contained more than 100 individually machined parts. Engineers eliminated the Blish-lock delayed blowback mechanism, removed the compensator and cooling fins, switched the foregrip from vertical to horizontal, and substituted stamped components wherever the tolerances allowed it. Unit cost fell from $200 in 1921 to roughly $70 by mid-1942, and to approximately $45 by February 1944 for the simplified M1A1 variant, a reduction of nearly 80%, achieved without abandoning the weapon's fundamental .45 caliber automatic fire capability. The specific manufacturing sequence behind that cost curve is itself a small case study in how quickly American industry could iterate once a contract was awarded. Savage Arms, which had no prior submachine gun production experience before the war, retooled its Utica, New York plant and was producing finished M1928A1 Thompsons within months of receiving the contract, at a unit cost of $42.94 by early 1942, competitive with Auto Ordnance's own Bridgeport facility, despite Auto Ordnance holding the original design license and decades more familiarity with the weapon's internal tolerances. Two firms with substantially different institutional histories converged on comparable production costs within roughly the same window, a pattern that reflected the broader depth of American precision manufacturing capacity available to absorb a wartime contract, rather than any specific advantage either company held individually. Production reached roughly 500,000 units in 1942 alone. Total wartime production of all Thompson variants approached 1.7 million, with the simplified M1/M1A1 family alone accounting for 1,387,134 of that total. Manufacture of the original complex M1928A1 pattern ceased in 1944, as the cheaper, stamped steel M3 grease gun entered mass production specifically to replace it in new unit issue, though Thompsons already in the field continued in service through the war's end and well beyond it in some theaters. Germany's own submachine gun production across the entire war, the MP-38 and MP-40 combined, totaled approximately 910,000 units. The MP-40 was, by most technical comparisons, a perfectly serviceable weapon, built from roughly 38 stamped parts rather than the Thompson's 100-plus machined components, and considerably cheaper to produce per unit. What it was not was available in anything close to the quantity the American production curve had achieved by the time the two weapons met each other regularly on the same battlefields. The first substantial contact between German forces and Thompson-equipped American units came during Operation Torch in November 1942. The 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment and elements of 2nd Corps landed with M1A1 Thompsons issued to NCOs and selected personnel at a ratio German intelligence had not anticipated. A German officer of the 10th Panzer Division, reporting from Tunisia in January 1943, described the volume of automatic fire encountered at Kasserine Pass as unlike anything experienced on the Eastern Front. His specific phrase, recorded in the after-action assessment, was that it seemed as though every second man carried a machine pistol. German units in Tunisia attempted a specific countermeasure within weeks of the first encounters, lengthening the interval between contact and counter-assault on the theory that American ammunition expenditure, however large, was still finite within a given engagement, and that a defender who simply waited out the initial burst of fire before counterattacking might catch American troops in the specific window after a magazine change. The tactic occasionally worked at the platoon level. It did not scale, because the same flexible distribution that made American Thompson positions hard to predict also meant a defender who successfully waited out one position's reload cycle was frequently still inside the effective range of 2 or 3 others he had not located at all. The Italian campaign that followed, from September 1943 through the war's final months, became the weapon's most extensive proving ground, and the place where German tactical assessments of it accumulated into something closer to settled doctrine. At the Rapido River crossing in January 1944, German defenders from the same 15th Panzer Grenadier Division that would later hold San Pietro reported that American assault boats crossed under what survivors described as continuous, rather than aimed, fire. Streams of bullets that made manning a fixed defensive position across the water close to impossible, regardless of the MG-42's superior individual rate of fire, because the MG-42 existed at 1 per squad, while Thompson fire could be concentrated, unpredictably, at whatever point in the line the American command chose to mass it. The 4 battles for Monte Cassino, January through May 1944, extended this education further. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, elite German paratroopers, veterans of Crete and the Eastern Front, defended the monastery heights, a structure whose meter-thick stone walls had already absorbed weeks of Allied bombing, without losing their basic defensive integrity, leaving the building's interior corridors and stairwells as the actual contested ground, long after the exterior had been reduced to rubble. The defenders reported a problem specific to that interior fighting. A rifle's range advantage meant nothing in corridors rarely longer than 15 meters, and the building's stone construction, which had protected against artillery, channeled automatic fire down hallways in ricochet patterns that made any single doorway a liability to hold. In the close, broken terrain of Cassino's ruins, the Thompson's .45 ACP round, limited in range but devastating at the engagement distances urban rubble actually produced, proved specifically suited to exactly the kind of fighting the monastery's interior forced on both sides. The specific numbers behind the Thompson's ballistic performance explain why this terrain favored it so completely. The M1A1 fired at 600 to 700 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity around 920 feet per second, and an effective range that rarely exceeded 50 yards in practical combat use. Set against the Carabiner 98K's theoretical 500-meter iron sight range and bolt-action cycle limiting practical fire to roughly 15 aimed rounds per minute, the rifle was, on a specification sheet, the more capable weapon by almost every conventional measure: longer range, flatter trajectory, superior accuracy at distance. Combat studies compiled later in the war found that roughly 90% of actual infantry engagements occurred within 100 meters, regardless of theater or terrain, a range bracket in which the rifle's specification sheet advantages simply ceased to apply, because the range at which the rifle outperformed the Thompson was rarely the range at which the two weapons actually met. The weapon pool system that actually governed Thompson distribution by mid-1944 is worth stating precisely, because the popular image of every American rifleman carrying one is not accurate and obscures what actually made the weapon tactically significant. Beginning June 30, 1944, Standard Army Rifle Company headquarters maintained a pool of 6 M1A1 Thompsons, 6 BARs, and 5 bazookas, distributed at the company commander's discretion to whichever specific task seemed to call for them: scouts, point men on a patrol, NCOs leading a house-clearing team, soldiers assigned to night operations. The Marine Corps had moved further and earlier, authorizing submachine guns for squad leaders beginning in July 1942, with Marine parachute units eventually equipping both squad leaders and assistant squad leaders, the highest concentration of submachine guns in any standard American infantry formation. This flexible, discretionary distribution was, in its own way, as tactically significant as the weapon's raw rate of fire. German defenders facing a fixed German squad knew, structurally, where its 1 or 2 automatic weapons would be positioned, because German organizations specified it. American Thompsons, by contrast, appeared wherever a given company commander judged close combat was likely on a given day, which meant German defenders could not extrapolate from one encounter to the next nearly as reliably, and frequently misjudged where the next concentration of automatic fire would actually come from. Anzio, from January 1944, demonstrated what sustained Thompson employment looked like over months rather than a single assault. The beachhead, besieged by German forces for roughly 4 months, became something close to a laboratory for automatic weapons tactics under static conditions that should, in principle, have favored the besieging Germans' longer-range rifles and more deliberate fire discipline. British 1st Division troops, Commonwealth forces, and the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division all drew extensively on Thompsons during the static fighting. The 3rd Infantry Division, defending the Mussolini Canal sector specifically, requisitioned additional weapons beyond its standard allocation from replacement depots once the value of concentrated automatic fire in that terrain became apparent to unit commanders on the ground. A German soldier of the Hermann Göring Division, describing a night infiltration attempt on February 16, 1944, reported that his unit had closed to within 30 meters of American positions undetected before contact, and that when the Americans opened fire, the effect was not the measured, individually aimed bursts of a machine gun crew, but several separate automatic weapons firing simultaneously from different points in the line. His company lost roughly half its strength in under 2 minutes. When American forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, German defenders encountered Thompson-equipped assault troops in the first wave. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had distributed M1A1 Thompsons to squad leaders, assistant squad leaders, and scouts before the drop. Rangers assaulting Point du Hoc carried them specifically configured for the close quarters work of clearing bunkers once the cliff had been climbed. Heinrich Severloh, the German machine gunner, later remembered as the so-called Beast of Omaha for the casualties his MG-42 inflicted from a fortified position above the beach, survived the battle and described in post-war interviews how the character of the fighting changed once American troops closed to the seawall. The short automatic weapons, what German soldiers had taken to calling Chicago typewriters, a label borrowed directly from the same interwar gangster association German intelligence had originally dismissed the weapon for, let American soldiers move and fire in the same motion, substituting volume for the precision a rifle required. Severloh's own position illustrates the specific tactical asymmetry at play with unusual clarity. His MG-42, by every individual specification, outperformed any Thompson in the American assault wave. Higher cyclic rate, longer range, a quick-change barrel that let sustained fire continue indefinitely. What it could not do was move. Severloh fired from a fixed position for hours, devastatingly effective against troops still in the open water and on the beach itself, and entirely unable to relocate once American troops closed the range and began working toward his flank with weapons that, unlike his own, did not require him to remain stationary to use them. The bocage terrain inland from the beaches initially appeared to favor German defenders, dug into hedgerow positions with limited fields of fire and ample concealment. The specific tactical problem the bocage posed for any attacker was the embankment itself. Earthen banks, several feet high, topped with dense hedge growth, that German squads tunneled into and fired through firing ports cut at ground level, invisible until the muzzle flash gave the position away. American infantry developed a specific countermeasure. A Thompson gunner working close alongside a Sherman, the tank's main gun blasting a hole through the embankment at a suspected position, while the Thompson covered the breach the instant it opened, denying German defenders the seconds they needed to relocate to the embankment's reverse face once their forward position was compromised. What German officers found specifically difficult to credit, more than the weapon's mechanical performance, was the logistics that sustained it. A German infantry regiment in 1944 typically received roughly 50,000 rounds of small arms ammunition per week. An American unit equipped with Thompsons could expend a comparable quantity in a single day of sustained combat. The United States produced approximately 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition across the entire war. German small arms production across all calibers never exceeded roughly 2.5 billion rounds annually, even at its wartime peak, a gap that made the tactical question of how freely to expend ammunition in a given firefight a genuinely different calculation on each side, not merely a difference in doctrine or training philosophy. German logistics officers who did the arithmetic on this gap reportedly calculated that a single sustained Thompson burst consumed ammunition worth more in raw material and manufacturing cost than a German soldier's daily pay, and that American units expended such bursts by the thousand without apparent institutional concern, while German units tracked individual cartridges with the kind of care a resource-constrained supply chain enforces on everyone using it. This disparity did not merely permit different tactics. It made certain tactics, on the German side, simply unavailable, regardless of how clearly German officers came to understand what the Americans were doing and why it worked. The weapon's distinctive sound became its own form of battlefield intelligence. German veterans reported being able to identify American positions by the deeper, more percussive report of .45 caliber fire against the higher pitch signature of the MG-42, or the comparatively quiet crack of bolt-action rifles. A recognition that worked both ways, in the sense that German soldiers came to associate that specific sound with positions that were, tactically, already lost. Hürtgen Forest fought from September 1944 into February 1945. Presented terrain that should, on paper, have neutralized much of the Thompson's advantage. Dense tree cover limiting visibility, rough ground slowing movement, and engagement distances that favored the German rifle's longer effective range over the Thompson's roughly 50-yard zone of real authority. The fighting there is remembered in most accounts as one of the costliest and least successful American operations of the entire European campaign, a reminder that no single weapon, however effective in other terrain, could compensate for the forest's fundamental tactical disadvantages. Limited visibility that favored whoever held the prepared defensive position, artillery that detonated in the canopy and showered fragments downward regardless of foxhole depth, and supply routes that German artillery had pre-registered with the same patience the terrain itself rewarded. The weapon adapted rather than simply failing within these worse conditions. American troops used sustained Thompson fire to sweep treetop height, detonating wire-triggered German mines and grenades rigged into branch forks before advancing infantry reached them, a use the weapon's designers had certainly never anticipated, exploiting the .45 caliber round's mass to punch through undergrowth that deflected lighter projectiles. The forest fighting also exposed the weapon's genuine limits rather than confirming unqualified dominance. German snipers and machine gunners positioned at range could engage advancing Americans before Thompsons came within their effective envelope at all, and some American units in the densest sections of the forest reportedly preferred captured German rifles for specific long-range tasks when ammunition resupply through the terrain became unreliable. The lesson the Army drew from Hurtgen was not that the Thompson had failed, but that it required combination with rifle range and BAR, sustained fire, to cover the full distance band a squad might need to fight across. A refinement of combined arms tactics at squad level rather than a simple validation of one weapon. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the besieged perimeter at Bastogne demonstrated the weapon's value specifically in defense rather than assault. Paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, surrounded and facing repeated German probes, used Thompsons as part of their final protective fires at close range, where terrain had funneled German infantry into predictable approach lanes. Elements of Kampfgruppe Piper, spearheading the German offensive's northern thrust, encountered Thompson-equipped American infantry at Stoumont and several adjacent points. German armor retained its advantage at range, but American infantry working in close enough to negate that range advantage prevented German tanks from receiving the close infantry support their own doctrine specified, repeatedly disrupting the combined arms coordination German tank infantry teams depended on. By March 1945, at the Rhine crossings, American combat engineers crossing in assault boats carried Thompsons almost as standard equipment for the specific task, laying down suppressive fire that German observers at Remagen, where American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, described as more intense than anything they had calculated for in planning the bridge's demolition. German efforts to destroy the span under fire were complicated specifically by the volume of automatic weapons fire directed at the demolition team from individual American soldiers, rather than from crew-served weapons alone. The demolition party assigned to finish wiring the charges under fire took casualties before completing the work, a delay the after-action assessment attributed directly to suppressive fire none of the planning had budgeted for, and that proved sufficient, combined with earlier mechanical failures, to leave the span standing long enough for American troops to seize it intact. German military attachés posted with Japanese forces in the Pacific sent comparable reports back to Berlin in 1944, observing Marine operations and noting that American assault troops advanced under continuous Thompson fire against Japanese positions built to withstand artillery, positions that automatic small arms volume, rather than heavier ordnance, was neutralizing at the point of contact. These reports, reaching Berlin in parallel with the accumulated Western Front assessments, confirmed for German plans a pattern that no single theater's experience could be dismissed as anomalous. Wherever American infantry doctrine met an opponent organized around the rifle and a small number of crew-served automatic weapons, the result favored distributed firepower regardless of terrain, climate, or the specific enemy on the other side of it. American soldiers received Thompson training that would have been logistically impossible for a German training pipeline operating under wartime ammunition rationing. Stateside training camps fired recruits through hundreds of rounds during basic instruction, building the specific motor memory, instinctive point shooting without deliberate sight alignment, clearing a stoppage by feel, reloading without breaking eye contact with a threat, that distinguishes a weapon used reflexively from one merely carried. The training doctrine specifically de-emphasized the careful sight picture a rifle qualification course demanded, on the theory that a man trying to align iron sights on a moving target at 15 yards in a darkened building had already lost whatever time advantage the weapon's volume of fire was supposed to provide him. German replacements arriving at frontline units by late 1944, by contrast, frequently reached combat having fired only a handful of live rounds and training of any kind. A direct consequence of an ammunition economy that could not subsidize extensive rehearsal on top of frontline consumption. This training gap compounded the raw production disparity. Even captured Thompsons, when German units acquired them along with usable ammunition, rarely produced American-level effectiveness in German hands, because the weapon's advantages depended on a degree of practice familiarity that limited captured ammunition stocks could not support for long. Wehrmacht directives on employing captured American weapons survive in the documentary record and reveal a specific tension. Official guidance acknowledged the Thompson's effectiveness and authorized its use when ammunition was available, while simultaneously warning units not to depend on supply chain Germany had no ability to replenish once the original captured stock was exhausted. A captured Thompson with 30 rounds was a useful windfall for an afternoon. It was not, and could not become, a sustainable element of a German squad's standard loadout. By late 1944, German tactical doctrine had begun visibly adapting to the pattern. Official guidance recommended dispersed defensive positions, greater emphasis on long-range engagement, and expanded use of mines and obstacles to channel American advances into pre-registered kill zones. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division, rebuilt in late 1944 from a combination of disbanded Luftwaffe ground personnel and convalescent wounded returning to frontline duty, received this guidance along with the rest of the Army and documented, in its own surviving unit diary, a specific obstacle to executing it. A division built from men recovering from previous wounds or transferred from non-infantry branches lacked the baseline rifle marksmanship the new doctrine's long-range emphasis assumed, regardless of how sound the doctrine itself was on paper. The final battles inside Germany itself, Aachen in October 1944, then Cologne, then the approach to Nuremberg and Munich in the war's last months, showed the cumulative effect of this gap at its starkest. German defenders at Aachen, from the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, had organized the city's defense around the assumption that an attacker would move building to building along the street, exposing himself at each doorway in a predictable sequence. German machine gun positions had been sighted to cover. American assault teams instead moved laterally through connected basements and shared walls between adjoining buildings wherever the city's older construction permitted it, surfacing inside structures German defenders had already marked as cleared or not yet reached, and using Thompsons specifically because the weapon's compact length made it usable in stairwells and basement corridors a rifle's length made impractical to bring to bear quickly. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's post-war interviews with German officers, conducted specifically to extract tactical lessons from the defeated side, recorded a consistent acknowledgement. German infantry doctrine, built around the rifle, supplemented by 1 or 2 crew-served automatic weapons per squad, had no organizational answer to an opponent capable of achieving fire superiority at the individual squad level that German formations could typically only achieve by concentrating an entire company's automatic weapons together. This was not, in the assessment German officers themselves offered after the war, primarily a story about one weapon's design superiority. It was an acknowledgement of an organizational ceiling, the most automatic firepower a German company commander could mass at one point against the least an American company commander would bother massing for the same task. When West Germany established the Bundeswehr in 1955, the new force initially fielded American-supplied weapons, including Thompsons, before transitioning to standardized NATO equipment, a practical, unsentimental acknowledgement of what had actually proven effective against German forces a decade earlier, adopted by an institution with every professional reason to study its own defeat closely. The broader concept that Thompson had demonstrated, automatic firepower distributed down to the individual soldier rather than concentrated in a small number of designated crew-served weapons, became, within another decade, close to universal doctrine rather than a peculiarly American extravagance. Soviet planners studying captured German after-action reports from the Eastern and Western fronts contributed to the reasoning behind the AK-47's intermediate cartridge assault rifle concept, which aimed to deliver comparable squad-level automatic firepower within a production and ammunition cost structure the Soviet economy could sustain more readily than a full-power rifle round fired automatically. The Korean War, fought from 1950 to 1953, offered an unplanned second test of the same underlying principle against an entirely different opponent under different terrain and climate conditions. Surviving German officers who had served as military observers attached to United Nations forces in Korea, a small number of former Wehrmacht personnel retained informally for their combat experience analyzing infantry tactics, reportedly noted that American units facing Chinese mass infantry assaults employed close-range automatic weapons fire in a manner they recognized directly from their own wartime experience on the opposite end of it. The tactic that had defeated organized, well-equipped German divisions in Italy and France proved equally effective against a numerically overwhelming but comparatively under-equipped Chinese infantry force a continent away and 7 years later. Evidence, to the extent informal post-war observation can constitute evidence, that what the Thompson had demonstrated was not specific to fighting Germans, German terrain, or German doctrine, but a more general principle about what concentrated, close-range automatic fire does to any infantry force organized primarily around the rifle. The Thompson's specific design lineage did not end with the war either. Auto Ordnance continued limited civilian and law enforcement production of Thompson variants for decades afterward, and the weapon's basic blowback operating principle, simplified repeatedly through the 1930s and 1940s cost reduction program, influenced submachine gun designs well beyond its own service life. Surplus M1A1s, decommissioned from American and Allied inventories through the 1950s, turned up in conflicts across 3 continents over the following 2 decades. A second life that had nothing to do with the specific industrial conditions that had produced the weapon in the first place, and everything to do with the simple fact that a working automatic weapon, once it exists in quantity, tends to keep circulating long after the war that justified building it has ended. The German soldier who wrote the diary entry at San Pietro Infine in December 1943 did not survive to see any of this. What he recorded, in the specific and immediate terms available to an infantryman who had just watched his position become untenable, was a tactical observation. The Americans fight differently. The full explanation behind that observation took the rest of the war, and most of a decade afterward, to work out in the kind of institutional detail the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's interviews eventually produced. The weapon itself, heavy, complex, expensive by the standards of every other army that considered fielding it, was never the whole answer. It was the visible, audible instrument of an industrial decision that Germany's own military establishment had correctly diagnosed as impractical in 1921, and then watched, 2 decades later, an opponent with sufficiently different economics simply choose to make anyway. There is a specific irony in how completely Germany's original 1921 assessment had been correct about everything except its own implicit assumption of universality. The Thompson was exactly as expensive as German observers calculated. It consumed ammunition at exactly the wasteful rate German logistics officers would have refused to authorize for their own forces. It required exactly the kind of precision manufacturing German industry, even before wartime strategic bombing degraded it further, would have struggled to sustain at scale. Every specific technical objection in the original German report held up under wartime scrutiny. What did not hold up was the unstated premise underneath all of them, that an army facing those same costs would necessarily make the same choice Germany had made. The American economy looked at an identical cost-benefit calculation and arrived at a different answer, not because American planners disagreed with the German arithmetic, but because the variables on the American side of that arithmetic were different enough that the same equation produced an opposite conclusion.